Today, we're diving into a fascinating chapter of Northwest U.S. and Canadian history from the late 1800s to early 1900s, centered around the life of Sophie Morgeaux. Born around 1840 in Windermere, British Columbia, Sophie was of mixed heritage, with an Indigenous mother and a white father, though the identity of her parents remains uncertain. Raised in the household of Francois Morgeaux, Sophie grew up bridging two cultures, learning both Indigenous and settler ways of life, a blend that shaped her distinct and resilient character. She spent most of her life around Montana's tobacco plains, often transporting goods with her own pack string of cattle to nearby towns. Her work occasionally led her into fierce competition with rivals who tried to drive her out, but Sophie's determination kept her moving forward. Our reading today comes from True West Magazine's September 1983 issue, in an article titled Sophie Morgeaux, Savage or Sage, written by Gordon R. Gilman and illustrated by Mick Harrison. The story of Sophie Morgeaux reflects the complex and often turbulent times of the mid-19th century. Likely born in the early 1840s in the rugged terrain of Windermere, British Columbia, between what are now Banff and Cranbrook, Sophie's origins remain largely uncertain. Raised in the Morgeaux household, her parentage is widely believed to trace back to Hudson's Bay trader Edward Burland and an Indigenous woman, whose identity has been lost to history. Burland and Morgeaux were said to have exchanged partners, a practice not uncommon in that era, just months before Sophie's birth. Morgeaux, a figure respected by missionaries, was known for his piety, while Burland served as a religious leader among Indigenous communities. Yet, as one old-timer put it, the frontier was a queer community where relationships and family structures were fluid and unconventional. Despite her unique beginnings, Sophie emerged as a true product of her time, a resilient individual shaped by the mingling of cultures on the northwestern frontier. The spirit and choices of both Sophie Morgeaux and her adoptive father, Francois Morgeaux, were profoundly shaped by the wilderness and the resilient traditions of the time. While it remains unclear which fur trader truly fathered Sophie, her vigor and determination mirrored Morgeaux's own character. Morgeaux had ventured west initially with the Northwest Company, eventually moving further westward with the Shuswap people in 1819, finding his home in the rugged beauty of British Columbia's Columbia Valley. This untamed life with a band of free-spirited Shuswap was evidently what Morgeaux sought. He took a wife and awaited the arrival of a priest for their formal union. Father Peter de Smet documented one of these rare moments in a letter to Archbishop John Hughes on September 9, 1845. In it, he described his arrival at Windermere, where Morgeaux had awaited him to baptize his wife and children. On September 8th, the feast of the Nativity of the Blessed Virgin, de Smet performed the sacrament of baptism for Morgeaux's family and the children of his Indigenous companions. The Mass, celebrated in the wilderness, marked a solemn day for the remote valley as Morgeaux, reverently, took communion and received a nuptial blessing before a humble altar set against the grandeur of the Columbia River's source. Known as the monarch of the Columbia's headwaters, Morgeaux, a Canadian from St. Martin, Montreal, had spent 26 years in the remote wilds, embodying the spirit of an era that would shape both his and Sophie's lives. Francois Morgeaux's family roamed freely across the wilderness, with his portable palace made from rain and moose deer skins. As Morgeaux liked to say, he could embark on horseback with his wife and 7 children, landing wherever he pleased, with no one to dispute his freedom. When Father de Smet left the Morgeaux on September 9th, baby Sophie Morgeaux was likely among those baptized that day. Growing up, Sophie shared in her family's rugged, independent lifestyle, a blend of Indigenous traditions and the hard work of running a small business. Morgeaux was known as an independent trapper and trader, one of only 2 French Canadians in eastern Washington operating outside the fur company's stronghold. As Sophie matured, Morgeaux moved his family to the Colville region, bringing her along. Though little is recorded of her life there, she later recalled training at a convent, likely the mission near Kettle Falls, Washington. Known for her beauty, Sophie captured the admiration of many frontiersmen, though she chose Jean-Baptiste Chabot as her first husband. The marriage didn't last long, and she eventually went her own way, keeping her maiden name. Chabot, who would spend his last years with his daughter in Ronan, Montana, was but a brief chapter in her life. Sophie's life on the frontier was marked by the tension of her dual heritage. The dominance of white settlers, backed by firearms and strategic trading, drew her toward their ways, yet her indigenous heritage was always present. She absorbed social graces at the mission school, skills she could adapt to suit the occasion. Still, the behavior of her father and other white men left a stronger impression on her than the lessons of the priests. Her mother's quiet endurance as an indigenous woman of the subservient gender also influenced Sophie, shaping her approach to a life that would constantly balance between two worlds. In an era when indigenous women were typically confined to roles as either helpers to indigenous men or as possessions for white settlers, Sophie Morgeaux carved an unconventional path. Determined to rise above the narrow options available to women of mixed heritage, she aspired to the independence and business acumen often reserved for men. Though her marriage to John Baptiste Chabot ended before she moved to Montana, Sophie's life took on an even more audacious tone once she arrived on Tobacco Plains in the early 1880s. Weathered by a hard life, she was already seen as an old woman by travelers, yet her spirit was anything but worn. Rejecting the servile expectations placed on women like herself, Sophie built her own log cabin near what is now Eureka, Montana, and began raising cattle, a bold, pioneering move for a woman, let alone one with indigenous roots. She assembled her own pack train, transporting trade goods between Missoula, Montana, Walla Walla, Washington, and Fort Steele, British Columbia. After Fort Steele's initial mining boom, she opened a trading post in Windermere, eventually relocating her store to Tobacco Plains around 1880. As the Canadian Pacific Railroad took shape, Sophie expanded her ventures to include bootlegging, becoming a familiar presence in Canada's construction camps. In Golden, she faced fierce competition from white traders who sought to monopolize the liquor trade, even threatening her with violence to keep her out. But Sophie, unfazed, continued her operations, taking her pack train across the mountains to Calgary, which was booming with business opportunities. Despite her ventures far afield, she always returned to her cabin near Eureka, Montana, a testament to her tenacity and independence as one of the frontier's most resilient figures. Sophie's early home on Tobacco Plains was a modest log cabin, constructed from small logs she had dragged in behind a horse. The interior walls were covered with mud, and a simple chimney made of sticks and clay completed the structure. Located near the Kootenai villages, her cabin stood on a flat by Indian Creek, a long-favored camping site for the indigenous community. In 1883, Dr. George Mercer Dawson, a Canadian surveyor, passed through Tobacco Plains and described encountering two elderly indigenous women living in a one-room store, sparsely stocked with supplies. Dawson noted that one of the women, who had only one eye, introduced herself as Sophie, the daughter of Francois Morgeaux. Later, Sophie relocated her cabin store to Kootenai Flats. Another explorer, a Stanley Hill, documented his visit to her store on September 20th, 1883. Hill described her as an older woman wearing green spectacles, who greeted his party with a simple, "Me Sophie." Her store was well stocked at the time, and they purchased flour, rice, venison, and butter. Through these encounters, Sophie's resilience and resourcefulness shine, embodying her ability to survive and thrive independently, even in the most rugged conditions. On September 21st, an entry described Sophie's home on a scenic knoll, a prime spot for a settlement. Nearby, Kootenai people had settled, contributing to Sophie's enterprise by crafting mats, hunting, fishing, and assisting with other tasks. Known for her boundless energy, Sophie had 3 groups actively prospecting mines and maintained a sizable herd of cattle. While stories vary on how she lost her eye, some attributing it to a violent encounter and others to an accident, it was clear that Sophie's spirit was anything but subdued. Her one-eyed appearance and advancing age did little to deter admirers. In fact, she was pursued by 2 fine-looking white men competing for her favor. Determined to secure her land, Sophie filed for water rights on a spring at Kootenai Flats, laying the groundwork for a homestead. As her age advanced, she focused on building up her herds of cattle and horses, preparing for the day when long-distance pack trips would no longer be feasible. Sophie's fierce independence and foresight underscored her remarkable adaptability, ensuring her place as a true frontierswoman and respected figure in her community. Through hard lessons, Sophie learned she could rely on no one but herself. A white trader she once trusted with her pack train and cash to buy goods in Missoula vanished without a trace, never to be seen on tobacco plains again. This experience cemented her sharp, resourceful approach to business, a strategy she tailored uniquely to her circumstances. In her dealings with local indigenous customers, Sophie adopted the tactics of white traders but with her own inventive flair. On one occasion, she priced buckskin needles at $5, despite protests that $1 was the usual price. Unfazed, she gravely explained that the man who crafted the needles had passed away, and soon needles would become rare treasures, available at no price at all. When crowds flocked to her little creek to fish, Sophie took advantage by charging a toll. For those who refused to pay, she had a clever tactic, wading into the water and splashing wildly until all the trout darted away. These inventive methods reveal Sophie's keen sense for survival and business, turning every challenge into an opportunity on her own terms. Sophie's cabin was often bustling with visitors, indigenous community members, children, and other curious onlookers drawn not just by the promise of a meal, but by Sophie's vibrant presence. She had a warm, open-door policy, with good food on hand and a lively atmosphere that welcomed all. Her resilience was legendary, as one story illustrates. After a rib was broken and began to protrude from her side following a buggy accident, Sophie reportedly amputated it herself. Displaying the rib on her cabin wall with a pink bow, she turned what could have been a grim reminder into a symbol of her grit and independence. Sophie's identity, shaped by her mixed heritage, gave her a unique adaptability. She could embrace either her indigenous roots or her settler persona, depending on what the situation demanded, whether for profit or personal satisfaction. This blend of pragmatism and resilience sets Sophie apart, reflecting a rare wisdom that straddled both worlds, a life shaped by the balance of savage and sage qualities. By the early 1890s, Sophie Morgeaux had built a stable life. Her herds were growing, and her bond with the Kootenai community was stronger than ever. However, the harsh winter of 1892 to 1893 proved disastrous. Like many ranchers, she used up her hay reserves early, eventually resorting to chopping brush to feed her starving cattle. But it wasn't enough. When spring came, her herd of 130 cattle had been reduced to just 30 weakened animals, and her horses had also suffered greatly. To make matters worse, Sophie's dealings with certain white men during this time led to her financial ruin. These so-called business partners, who sometimes lived with her, ultimately took advantage of her trust, selling off her livestock in ways that left her with little return. Sophie, now advanced in years, lacked the resources and energy to rebuild. Although she remained independent and self-sufficient for as long as she could, her fortunes and vitality eventually faded, and the friends who once flocked to her cabin, both white and indigenous, drifted away. In her later years, Sophie stood as a testament to resilience. Though her story became one of hard-won independence lost to betrayal and misfortune. As the 20th century dawned, Sophie Morgeaux lived alone on her homestead, embodying the resilience that had defined her life. When asked about her age on a visit to the Gateway store, she quipped, "Well, I wasn't born yesterday," a remark that sparked laughter and a reminder that the old girl still had her spirit. Around 1915, her health began to decline, and she entrusted her remaining horses to Bill Davis, whose wife, a former nurse, helped care for her. Sophie passed away in October 1916 and was laid to rest in Eureka Cemetery, just a short distance from her original cabin in the Tobacco Plains, her beloved land, the heart of Kootenai territory. The pioneers of Tobacco Plains, especially the women, penned an epitaph for her. In their reflections, life went on in all its big little ways, without Sophie Morgeaux. Automobiles soon replaced packed trains, and fast highways connected the plains to towns she had once reached through arduous journeys with her packstring. Sophie, who perhaps never rode in a car until her funeral procession, marked by 3 vehicles, including the hearse, would have hardly recognized the modernized routes she once traversed on horseback. Sophie's life reflecting on Sophie Morgeaux's life. It's clear that in her unique time and place, most of us would have faced similar trials and likely stumbled in ways that she did, and perhaps taken pride in her resourceful, if unorthodox, choices. By the standards of her day, Sophie stood apart from the norms for women of mixed heritage, proving herself a formidable figure on the frontier. This story comes from True West Magazine's September 1983 issue. It's worth noting that when the women of Tobacco Plains described a true Democrat, they referred to the Democratic Party as it was roughly a century ago, very different from its modern form. If Sophie's life story intrigued you, Gene Barman's new 2022 book on Sophie Morgeaux offers a deeper look. For those interested in Western art, Mick B. Harrison, the illustrator of this piece, showcases work on his website, an homage to history and art from the frontier days. Here, we honor the lives and experiences of those who came before us, people whose paths we could only hope to walk. So, if you want to keep exploring untold history with us, be sure to subscribe,